I am fully vaxxed. I always wear my mask in indoor settings and outdoors when it's crowded. I wholeheartedly believe that vaccines provide protection against COVID and that masks help stop the transmission of the virus. So then, why am I making this video? Because this video is not about finding what is true. It's about understanding. Some people may not like this and say that it is irresponsible of me to make anything but truth the goal of vaccine and mask discussions. But I think that if truth is the end, we need to spend more time considering what our means are to arriving at that end. Is it scientific, partisan debate about whose medical journals and personal experience is correct? Or is it going to be empathy? I want to note that empathy is when you understand the feelings of another, but you do not have to share them. So while I am trying to create empathy, some understanding for where mask and vaccine skeptics come from, I do not agree with their beliefs. I still want people to get vaccinated. I still want everyone to wear masks when necessary. Though we intuitively feel that truth, such a beloved virtue, should be synonymous with usefulness, that is not always the case. For instance, when we say all guns are loaded, it is not because it is true. Of course, there are unloaded guns out there, but it is more useful to act as though it is true for our own safety. A tool of utility that all brains use to acquire information efficiently are heuristics, problem-solving tactics that increase your chance of achieving a goal, but they do not guarantee that you will do so. We use heuristics all the time to pre-specify where one should be searching for information. Maybe your favorite news sources are the New York Times, the Atlantic, and the Washington Post, so you use those as your primary sources of information. Now, if you were a perfect problem solver, you would look through every single news source the way algorithms do. But no, you recognize that that's impossible and would make your mind explode. So your brain pre-selects your search space to obtain information in a useful manner. By pre-selecting a search space, heuristics prejudge what is relevant. In other words, they bias your attention. Bias, understandably, has a very negative connotation, but I am simply applying bias to where your attention is, not what your beliefs are. And when it comes to directing your attention, bias is a necessary tool for navigating the world. If we were to search through every single piece of information until we either arrived at a conclusion or proved that it was impossible to come to one, we would be constantly experiencing what's called combinatorial explosion, when there is an unbelievably large number of search spaces. I'm going to quote John Vervaeke when, in one of our lectures, he said, "Relevance is not in the world. No piece of information is intrinsically or always relevant." We have to decide what is relevant, and heuristics are a major way that our brains do that. This is not to say that all ways of biasing your attention are equally valid. Of course, some are more productive, some are closer to what reality is. But I think it's important to establish that all brains do this, especially in a modern age of information overload. I think it's also important to establish that not all anti-mask and anti-vaxxers are the same. And just because someone is anti-mask does not mean that they are anti-vax as well, or vice versa. They frequently do predict one another, that is true, but it is not a guaranteed partnership. My parents were initially hesitant on the safety of vaccines, but they wore masks from the beginning. They always believed in the safety of masks. We must be honest when assigning such broad labels to people. Because anti-vaxxers and anti-maskers vary in their level of and reasons for being skeptical, finding empathy for them does not mean I am going to be empathetic with all of their claims. Again, we shouldn't treat these groups of people as some general group with all the same beliefs. Therefore, I'm going to address some of the most common reasons for anti-mask and anti-vax sentiments and decide whether empathy is deserved for those different reasons. A few of the dominant arguments for being anti-mask or anti-vax are: 1. Some institution of power, often either the government, the media, or pharmaceutical companies, are promoting vaccines for the sole purpose of profit. 2. Constantly announcing that masks and vaccines are an urgent necessity to fight against COVID creates unnecessary fear. This is so that the government can convince citizens that they need the government for protection, so that we re-elect them or put blind trust in them. 3. The vaccines and/or masks are not safe. 4. The vaccines and/or masks do not work. 5. COVID is not as dangerous as we are led to believe. I'm going to categorize number 1 and number 2 into trust in government/institutions, number 3 and number 4 in the efficacy of vaccines and masks, and number 5 will be a standalone. I'm sure there are other arguments that I have not included in this 1 to 5 list, but I'm just addressing the most common ones that I've seen and heard. Of course, not all of these arguments stand alone. There is often overlap. For instance, someone might believe that COVID is not as dangerous as we are led to think, and thus the reason for promoting vaccines is for profit. Number 3, 4, and 5 are often believed as a group as well, and some people might believe in all 5. Because they're also intertwined, what I talk about for one argument can certainly apply to another. Alright, let's start our journey towards empathy. According to Francis Fukuyama, trust in government rests upon 2 main points. 1. Citizens need to believe that their government has the, quote, expertise, technical knowledge, capacity, and impartiality to make the best available judgments. People need to feel assured that those in charge of decisions are highly qualified to speak on the given subject, and that they are doing what's best for the people, not to forward their own political interests. 2. Citizens need to trust the ruler and their immediate circle, whether that be the president, prime minister, chair, etc. Okay, so are there reasonable grounds not to trust our institutions? I'd say yeah. We already don't trust the government on a number of other issues that are geared towards the greater good, such as racial justice and climate change. Most people agree that the media is not an honest, virtuous actor, and is driven by what makes them the most money. Pharmaceutical companies are often accused of having a monopoly on medical products, of hence raising prices, and not facing proper liability for damage that they cause. Now, this is not really about whether any of these accusations are true or not, but these heavily shape how people perceive these institutions, and perception is everything when it comes to trust.
I don't think they're doing it anymore, but remember they came out and it was like, oh, we'll pay people $1,500 to take the vaccine. But isn't this the same government that every time we need a stimulus check, they can't come up with a deal, but they're willing to pay for it?
I can understand why some people are wary of these institutions' incentives, especially if you feel as though you have been let down by the government before. Millions of people are living paycheck to paycheck because of the pandemic, and it must be frustrating to see the government consider awarding $1.5K for getting the vaccine, but not be as willing to increase their stimulus aids and unemployment funding. For me personally though, I think the fact that the government is so profit-driven is the reason why they should genuinely care about moving past COVID effectively. COVID devastates the economy and hurts businesses. Even if you believed that the government is largely money-driven, which I believe too, why would they want to be complicit in their own struggles? Now, I know that many pro-vax and pro-mask individuals will want to add that the discussion surrounding trust is not about the government. Pro-vaxxers and pro-maskers don't pretend as if Boris Johnson or Joe Biden is some health expert. They are trusting the huge number of health officials and health experts that are urging people to wear masks and get the vaccines. They are trusting the health experts who advise the government on their laws and guidelines. It is these people that are highly qualified to talk about this subject. But I'm not sure it's possible to entirely separate politics from COVID. Those health experts who are crafting legal policies about what we should and shouldn't do are not immune to politics. They are influenced by their colleagues, by the desire to keep their jobs and appease the public, as Deborah Birx, the head of the American White House COVID task force, was often criticized for doing. Even our local family doctors have some personal discretion when it comes to prescribing medication and offering medical advice. Bottom line is that there is no such thing as pure, unbiased science. But not all bias is equal. We should be aware of what is influencing our biases as well as how strong they are. What about argument number 2? the fear of fear-mongering. I'd say it's also a valid worry. The government has a history of scaring citizens for achieving political ends. For instance, the war on drugs, the war on terror, and justifying the Iraq war by blowing the fear of terrorism out of proportion. The question of who can protect and guide us better throughout the pandemic was one of the most focal points of all political elections that happened during this pandemic period. Now, how empathetic I'm willing to be does depend on what they think the fear-mongering is trying to achieve. For instance, if they are suspicious that the government is trying to build a social reliance on them so that citizens feel a need to re-elect them back into power, I can see that. And I'm very sure that this does play a role in the government's decisions. The key word, though, is a role, not the only or main role. But if a worry about fear-mongering is combined with a belief that everything is staged, that there is no virus to be cautious of at all, then I am less inclined towards empathy. I'll touch on this more when I talk about argument number 5. The definition of COVID death is also something that can be confusing to most people. On Statistics Canada's page, they say, when a pre-existing condition is suspected of putting a person at higher risk of a severe course of COVID-19 resulting in death, the death is counted as a death due to COVID-19 rather than a death due to the pre-existing condition. It is also possible that the death may have been influenced by COVID-19 but caused by another disease or an unintentional injury event. In these situations, COVID-19 should still be recorded on the medical certificates of cause of death, but would not be considered a death due to COVID-19. Basically, if you had some medical condition that exacerbated the effects of COVID is still labeled as the main cause of your death, and the sidekicks of your death are added as an additional note. Similarly, if COVID fatally worsened your cancer or your lung disease, cancer or lung disease would still be put as the main cause of death, not COVID. Sounds fair enough. However, there was this infamous story about how someone died in a motorcycle crash in Orlando, and it was inputted into the database as a COVID death rather than a fatal vehicle accident. This angered a lot of people who were already doubtful about the intentions of the government. And I can't say that their anger is 100% misplaced. They're wrong, but if I didn't know better, I might have believed this story as well. How it works is that there is a 1 to 2 correction period after an initial input of data, so that the actual accuracy of labels put onto death certificates are only available after this correction period. But realistically, who's going to check those updated numbers? And do most people even know where to look for them? Probably not. Especially because the media only updates us about stories and numbers before they go through the correction process, because they want to be the first ones to let you know about this hot, shocking story. The media is not going to revisit old news because in today's age, consumption is quick. No one cares about what happened 2 weeks ago. People seem to have a lot more faith in random online testimonies than the government. But perhaps it's because they feel the government lacks transparency. For instance, in April, America announced that masks were no longer needed indoors for those who were fully vaccinated. However, only a few months later in August, they announced that everyone was required to wear masks again, including those who got both doses. They only released the paper that provided the scientific backing for this decision several days after, making many people wary as to why they didn't release an explanation earlier. Now, the explanation given by the CDC director was that citizens would have been upset either way.
If we waited until all the I's were dotted and T's were crossed and we had a pretty publication come out, the criticism was going to be, you waited until you had your pretty publication. How long have you known about this and didn't tell us?
Conversely, if they announced the new policies first, as they did, then people would wonder whether their policy was truly backed up with evidence. It's a really tough position to be in. While it is easy to criticize those with policy power, everything they do will cause people to speculate. I honestly hope both the pro and anti sides to this debate think about this. It's no secret that the internet has an overload of information. It has become so democratized to the point that there are virtually no barriers to entry. Anyone can publish anything, and it's accepted as a contribution to the discussion. How are we then to pick apart misinformation from trustworthy sources? I think pro-vax and pro-mask people sometimes take the correctness of their information for granted, and they are proud of being correct. But it's not as obvious as we like to tell ourselves. There are actually so many academic journals and papers that have findings about the downsides of wearing masks, the scary side effects of vaccines, etc. Again, these are academic journals and papers, not Steven Crowder. I'm not saying all academic publications are equally valuable, because obviously the level of rigor put into them, the methodology the researchers decided to use, the amount of peer review it went through, pre-existing biases, there's a whole list of non-experimental factors that lead to conflicting results between researchers. And honestly, the fact that there is so much contradictory evidence existing in academia is probably a problem with academic research itself, of not having enough fair vetting processes. This is likely worsened by the fact that people want to conduct and publish COVID research as fast as possible, since there's such a high demand for answers. Again, a reminder that I wholeheartedly believe in the effectiveness and importance of vaccines and masks. I just want to make that clear. But there's so much information out there, and the way that the media treats science is so misleading. They will write a news article about "science proves that," or "a new study shows that," as if one study is conclusive. This is especially harmful for COVID because people demand answers fast. But rigorous scientific research is not fast. It has to be carefully reviewed by multiple channels. It should take time to produce. The media brainwashes us into this expectation that science is somehow stable in its truth and is quickly available when it is not. Science is about constantly being open to doubt, about evolving. But when the media presents one new voice as being able to override all previously existing research, it conditions people into feeling as though any change in thought is a lie, or that they aren't actually following the science. For example, in the beginning of the pandemic, America, Canada, the UK, and several other European countries did not recommend mask wearing to their citizens.
Actually, the potential negative aspects of wearing masks, where people are not protecting their eyes, or other aspects of where the virus could enter your body. It increases the touching of your face. We find that it's removing personal protective equipment that can actually lead to infections. So,
can you define for people what the role of masks is, and why were we told to wait? Why were we told later in the spring to wear them when we initially were told not to?
The flip-flop between stances can make it feel as though they don't know what they're talking about, as if they don't know what actually works and what doesn't. Their past perspectives sometimes contradict what they instruct their citizens to do later on. I can understand the wariness around abiding policies set in place when the science is still evolving around this new virus, because that means even the people in power making these policies are in a learning process. They are bound to make mistakes, so we shouldn't be putting complete blind trust in them. And I also agree that a lot of people who willingly follow these mask mandates often do so incorrectly. For instance, you're not supposed to touch the outside of your mask because that's the part that's touching air particles and potential virus particles. But people take off their masks like this all the time, ruining the purpose of using a mask. Or they'll leave their mask in random places like the living room table or the pocket of their jeans and pick it up again by the potentially infected area with their bare hands. If we support mask usage, we should also be diligent in our understanding of the science behind how to effectively use them. Just because we believe we are on the right side of science doesn't exempt us from paying attention to the details of how to be right. Having said that, What I hope anti-vax and anti-mask individuals consider is that it is also reasonable for these health officials to be changing their opinions as the pandemic progresses. News sources are a false representation of how science should actually operate. This virus is new. It's something science has to take time to study and update knowledge on. The fact that health experts are openly changing their opinions is probably a sign that the scientific process of updating knowledge is working. Another point that I wanted to touch on is that many anti-vax or anti-mask believers provide a natural immunity argument. And in a very pro-science era, these people get belittled for being stupid and anti-science. I can't lie and pretend as if I've never rolled my eyes at a "my body will naturally protect itself" comment before. But I think it's quite interesting that at the same time, homeopathy and natural medicine has been gaining popularity in many other areas of medicine, such as gua sha, naturally regulating your hormones through your diet rather than doctor-recommended pills and prescriptions, massaging one part of your body to rid all of these mental health problems, and many pro-vax, pro-mask folks like to learn about and try these natural remedies. Now, of course, the examples that I gave don't have public health implications, like whether you successfully rely on natural means to regulate your own hormones is not going to damage anyone else's health. But that doesn't mean the epistemic foundation for these beliefs is any more solid. One thing I do find hard to empathize with is when anti-vaxxers claim that a rise in COVID cases is a sign that vaccines do not work at all, or work very ineffectively. That is a very big logical jump to make, because vaccines are not supposed to be a complete cure. I suggest taking time to look into the symptoms that the vaccinated versus unvaccinated experience, to see how, on average, those with the vaccine experience significantly less severe symptoms than those without it, and they make up a much smaller portion of hospitalization rates. They are also protected from long-term effects of COVID that you don't feel right now. For example, protection from long-lasting loss of smell and taste. Now, for this last argument, these are the people whom I am least able to empathize with. Because the argument they present tends to be, I didn't have COVID, and people I know who had COVID didn't have severe symptoms. Therefore, everyone else's claims must be over-exaggerated or a lie. They project their personal experiences onto society at large. We intuitively trust our own experiences more than others. Yes, this is the representative heuristic. But to dismiss such a huge number of voices expressing counter experiences is either egoistic or careless about the way in which you assess your beliefs. It's not as if there are 10 other people claiming that COVID has tragically taken the life of a loved one. It's not even hundreds. There are millions of people who can attest to this. And I especially think it's disrespectful to blow off all of the frontline healthcare workers who are treating these people in the ICU every day and who are telling us about the horrible stories they see. And yet somehow people who never have been in the ICU before, have never had to work night after night saving these lives. Somehow they feel as though their experiences can speak for all of these heroes. To be a good judge of information is to approach external sources with skepticism, but only when paired with self-reflection as well. I want to end with a little conversation about luck. The Ghost Map is a book that talks about the London cholera epidemic in the 1840s and 50s. At that time, they did not know that there were germs invisible to the naked eye, and so they were unaware that water could transmit diseases when it looked perfectly normal. The book talks about individuals who are trying to figure out what the hell is going on. One man believes that everyone is falling sick and dying because of bad smell, since the places that people are dying smelled awful. He followed the scientific process of gathering empirical data around him to conclude a potential cause and effect relationship. And I think it was a reasonable conclusion because our bodies are naturally wired to dislike bad smell, since it can be a sign of potential danger. For instance, food that has gone bad and can make us sick. Another man, who we now know was correct, hypothesized that the disease was somehow caused by the water. It was this completely crazy and bizarre guess at the time. No one ever thought that illnesses could be invisible. These two men both observed the same environment, but they drew different conclusions. They both wanted to solve the problem of cholera, worked hard to do so, but only the man who was correct is now regarded as a hero today. I wonder then whether these two men both had the same heroic, driven attributes, but one just luckily guessed the right hypothesis. When applying this to the vaccine and mask debate, how much does luck play into the accuracy of the side we choose? At the end of the day, both the pro-vax, pro-mask, and the anti-vax, anti-mask sides of the debate want what they feel is the best resolution to the pandemic. That's the goal, not proving that you are superior and making the other side feel stupid. When Nicki Minaj said she couldn't attend the Met Gala because they required everyone to be vaccinated, a lot of people made fun of her and created a lot of rude jokes. I feel like she was actually quite composed about the situation in the beginning, acknowledging that people should get vaccinated if it's required to work, and agreeing that vaccinated people are receiving more protection from COVID. But Twitter users just kept jabbing at her. And like, come on, who enjoys being publicly humiliated and hated on? The very common psychological response is to get defensive, especially when you feel as though you had been reasonable. So yeah, Nicki's tweets got aggressive later on, but maybe think about what prompted that to happen. Every time we decide to mock one another, we are fueling each other's resentment for one another. So can we please try to listen to each other more? I don't think I could have organized this video as best as I could, but it's a really touchy subject and it was hard to decide how to approach it because I felt that I couldn't please everyone no matter what I did. So here are my thoughts. Here are some things that I've just been thinking about and how I've been feeling about this whole anti versus pro-vaccine and masks discussion. You can like and subscribe if you want. I know this is a sensitive topic, and I think that's all the reason more to be respectful and civil towards each other. Thank you so much for watching. Let's keep talking, and I hope to hear from you soon. Bye!